He only sent a free telegram to a grieving widow, and for that, they tried to brand him a threat to the system. Boyd Hammer, the cold-faced company inspector, saw compassion as disobedience and silence as guilt. But something in the desert moved, and one quiet act sparked a reply no one could ignore. And just wait until you see how this quiet rebellion unfolded, and why, in the end, justice finally had its say. Elvin Grayson had long since stopped checking the time unless a train demanded it. He lived by the rhythm of the rails and the steady clack of the telegraph machine, not the ticking of clocks. Killarney Station sat low in the Nevada dust where sand crusted the windowsills and the wind dragged grit across the floorboards. Some called it a transfer point, others just a place in between. He was a man of habits. Morning coffee boiled over a rusted pot, black as tar. Papers stacked neatly by the window, all stamped and filed. The telegraph key, polished from years of use, rested under his right hand like a relic. In a world of movement, Elvin remained still, not out of peace, but because there was nowhere else to be. The company paid him in quarters and sleep. Western Relay owned the building, the wires, the air between the walls, but Elvin had his small control. The moments between signals, the space between words, the flicker of humanity in an otherwise mechanical code. The sun was already sliding toward the red ridge when he heard the steps on the gravel outside. Not boots, soft-soled. He looked up to see a woman approach, her dress dusty, her hair tied in a cloth wrap the color of old smoke. She walked with slow purpose, a folded paper in her hand. He didn't recognize her at first, but the look in her eyes struck him harder than memory ever could. Mary Ann Washburn. Widow of Joseph Washburn, the Paiute scout who once worked with the Army, the same man Elvin had seen helping unload wounded during the dry summer of '83. Joseph had died 2 months earlier in a rail accident near Fernley. Officially, the company called it a misstep on loose coupling. Everyone else knew it was a scheduling error, one that had never been admitted. She didn't ask for sympathy. She didn't even ask to sit. She handed him the paper like it weighed more than she did. A telegram, scribbled in careful block letters. It was meant for her brother, still living in the Walker Lake Reservation. The message was short, barely 15 words. A simple notice. A request for forgiveness. Elvin adjusted his glasses. "You know it's 15 cents a word," he said, not unkindly. She nodded and unfolded a cloth from her palm. 3 coins rolled onto the counter. Old silver dimes, worn smooth. Not enough. She looked him in the eye, calm, unflinching. Not a plea, not pride either, just the plain fact of her presence, her need. Elvin stared at the coins, then back at the machine. No trains were due, the lines were quiet. The station, for once, felt like it belonged to no one. Without another word, he took the telegram, typed it out, and sent it. The clicks echoed like distant footsteps fading across a dry plain. He logged it under a generic identifier. No payment, no initials. She gave a single nod, turned, and walked out into the dusk. Elvin didn't move for several minutes. The message was gone, but something lingered. In the coming days, he would wonder if the act had been small, or the start of something waiting beneath the surface. At the time, it felt like nothing more than what decency required. But decency, he would soon learn, was a dangerous thing to practice when no one else remembered what it meant. 3 days passed without comment. The station resumed its rhythm. Freight moving east at dusk, passenger car west at dawn. Dust gathered in the corners. Elvin swept it out each morning like he always did. Nothing had changed, on the surface, but change never knocks. It arrives quietly, in a new set of footsteps, a different weight in the air, a silence that goes on just a moment too long. It was just past noon when the company car appeared. Black, boxy, windows shaded. No scheduled arrival, no signal sent. Elvin watched it pull in from behind the safety glass, a half-full cup of coffee cooling in his hand. The man who stepped out wasn't dusty like the others. His shoes were polished, his shirt pressed. He carried nothing, not even a briefcase, just a pocket watch and a posture that told you he wasn't here to chat. He introduced himself as Boyd Hammer, Field Inspector, Northern Division, Western Relay. The handshake was short and cold. Elvin nodded, moved aside, and let him in. Hammer walked through the small office like a man measuring shadows. He looked at the telegraph machine, then the ledger, then the oil-stained chair in the corner. Each glance silent, but exact. Then he turned and held up a thin slip of carbon paper, the kind only supervisors were supposed to have access to. "This was routed through your board on the evening of the 11th, Hammer said. Elvin didn't answer. "Unregistered. No payment recorded. Source listed as internal dispatch." Which it wasn't. Still, Elvin said nothing. Hammer's tone didn't rise. That wasn't his style. He wasn't there to argue. He was there to document compliance, or the lack of it. "We don't make policy, Mr. Grayson. We enforce it. Exceptions lead to habits. Habits lead to losses. You understand that, I assume." Elvin met his gaze, steady and unblinking. There was a long pause, not hostile, not submissive, just quiet resistance. Hammer studied him, then laid 2 papers on the desk. "Confession form. You sign. This stays internal. 1 week's suspension, no record." He pointed to the second page. "Or you name the party who coerced the transaction. We've seen these patterns before. Someone pushes the buttons. You just happened to be sitting here when it came through. Happens." Elvin didn't move. He glanced once at the forms, then slid them back across the table, untouched. "I sent it," he said simply. Hammer tilted his head, curious. Not angry, just surprised. "And why?" Elvin looked past him, out the window. The desert shimmered in silence. "Because it needed to be sent. That was the end of it." Hammer stood, pocketed the forms, adjusted his tie. He didn't repeat himself. He didn't threaten. The silence that followed was louder than anything he might have said. He left without another word. Elvin stood in the middle of the office for a long while, listening. But the machine was still. The lines, for the first time in years, were completely quiet. He didn't yet know what Hammer would write in his report, or how high that report would go. But he did know this. In companies like Western Relay, silence wasn't the absence of noise. It was the space where decisions got made. And once those decisions were made, they did not turn back. That night he sat by the machine just listening, not for signals but for change, for consequence, for the slow, invisible weight of a decision that refused to stay small. Elvin woke before the sun, not from alarm, just the body reacting to something the mind hadn't named yet. The air had a different quality, dry, yes, but heavier, as if even the heat had decided to wait before rising. He stepped outside with a tin cup of warm water, watching the blue of morning stretch thin over the desert. Freight cars sat on the siding, long, still beasts of rust and iron. They'd arrived in the night, but Elvin hadn't heard them come. That wasn't unusual. What was the silence that followed. Something was off. He walked along the row of cars, coffee untouched in his hand. On the first car, someone had drawn a vertical line in red ochre. Clean, deliberate. Further down, a jagged symbol like a split sun. Another bore a set of parallel slashes, then spirals. The entire side of the last car was coated in sweeping strokes of color. Red, black, yellow, layered with care, like a story meant to be read from a moving train. He recognized some of the markings, symbols from the old stories, from the desert. From the people who had lived here long before telegraph wire ever split the sky. These weren't acts of vandalism, they were messages. Elvin stood still for a long time. Then he turned and looked out toward the ridge line. Nothing moved, no riders. No scouts, only the long breath of a rising sun. By midday, word had reached the town. "They painted every car on the north line," said the station mechanic, eyes wide. "Same colors, same symbols." By evening, the sheriff arrived. By nightfall, cavalry patrols were on standby along the westbound track. The assumption was instant and loud. A signal. They're planning something. The officers used phrases like coordinated disruption and symbolic challenge. But Elvin knew better. This wasn't a warning, it was a reply. Someone had finally answered. The next day, Boyd Hammer returned. This time he wasn't alone. 2 uniformed men stood by the company car as he entered the station. He didn't ask. He handed Elvin a sealed envelope with an official stamp. Under the terms of Regional Emergency Code, Elvin Grayson was to be placed under administrative arrest pending investigation for unauthorized transmissions resulting in public disorder. Elvin didn't argue. He folded his hands and followed them. As they drove away, he looked back once. Not at the building, but at the tracks. The painted freight cars, now in full daylight, shimmered like murals, stories moving silently across the desert. The company had heard them. So had the government. Everyone, it seemed, was finally listening, not to the words Elvin had sent, but to the echo of what it meant for them to arrive. And still, no one spoke the truth out loud. Not yet. Because truth, like sunrise, came slowly, but when it did, it showed everything. The courtroom in Bridgetown was small, barely large enough to hold 2 rows of benches. The air inside smelled of dry wood and ink. Walls the color of aged paper, windows smeared from too many seasons without proper cleaning. There were no reporters, only a court clerk, a tired judge in his 3rd term, and a handful of townspeople who'd heard whispers and came to see for themselves. Elvin sat without chains, but with something heavier around him, the weight of accusation delivered not by a single man, but by a system that had no face, only policies. Boyd Hammer was called first. His tone remained even, language precise. He spoke of regulations, breaches of conduct, the potential for unrest. He described Elvin's action as a catalytic failure in the command chain, and cited clause after clause from the company handbook. He never raised his voice, never gestured. But every sentence sounded like a nail. The prosecutor followed his lead. He painted Elvin as a man who may not have meant harm, but had opened a channel that others used. The message had traveled unvetted. The result? A movement, a symbol, a challenge to order. Elvin said nothing, until someone called for a witness. And she walked in, not with drama, not with ceremony, just steady footsteps and silence. Marianne Washburn took the stand. She held in her hands a folded copy of the telegram, the same one Elvin had sent. Her voice was low, unrehearsed. She explained slowly what the message had been, not a call to rise, but a plea to her brother to return home. She had not seen him since the funeral. The message said, "Joseph is gone, I forgive you, come back." Nothing more. The room shifted. The judge adjusted his glasses. The clerk stopped writing for a moment. Even Hammer, still seated in the gallery, tilted his head slightly. Then came another voice, this time from the back. Thomas Dewey, senior dispatcher from the Reno division, rose and approached. He hadn't been summoned. He asked permission to speak under oath. He testified that messages like these, personal, unsanctioned, sent in moments of need, had always existed. They were often ignored, sometimes lost. But Elvin had sent one, just one, and it was right. The silence afterward felt deeper than any argument. When the verdict came, it wasn't loud. The judge simply stated, "The court finds no malicious intent, charges dismissed." But the effect rippled. Western Relay, facing rising attention and internal dissent, issued a quiet policy revision 2 weeks later. A single line added to a thick manual. In urgent human circumstances, operators may, at their own discretion, transmit messages of mercy. No announcement, no memo. But every operator across the region read it. Elvin returned to Killarney Station. The dust was the same. So were the trains. But now, every wire that hummed above him carried not just code, but the memory of a choice. One that didn't fit protocol. And that, somehow, made the line stronger. Elvin never asked for his desk back. It was waiting for him anyway. The same worn wood, the same chair that leaned slightly left, as if time had nudged it into a habit. The office smelled like dust and hot metal. Familiar. He sat down and rested his fingers on the telegraph key. It had been weeks, maybe more, but the rhythm came easily. The wire was quiet, not dead, just listening. The first message came in just after sunrise, a routine freight check from Sandpoint. He answered it without hesitation, then leaned back and watched the desert through the window. Nothing had changed, and somehow, everything had. The painted cars still passed through, though most had been cleaned by now. But others bore marks scratched in, not loud or angry, but intentional. A spiral, a half moon, a faded stripe under a serial number. Not protest, just presence. Elvin didn't say anything about them, neither did anyone else. But he noticed. Once or twice a month, a parcel arrived. No sender listed. Inside, small things. Sage, wrapped in cloth, a strip of leather, a shell. Always quiet, always folded with care. He kept them in the drawer where the unpaid forms used to be. Marianne didn't return to the station, But her message had gone further than she could have known. It had traveled beyond the lines, beyond Elvin, beyond the company, and somehow it stayed. One day, a school teacher passing through asked him what the most important message he'd ever sent was. He thought a long time before answering. It was short, he said, but it changed the tone of the wire. She smiled, wrote it down, moved on. That night, Elvin didn't send any messages. He just sat by the machine and listened, to the wire, to the room, to whatever passed quietly between places no one remembered until someone reached across them. Outside, the desert was still. The air cooling, the sky turning a soft blue before dark. And somewhere, beyond what the wires could carry, something waited. Not loud, not urgent, just present.